Good evening, good evening. If I could ask all of you to, I hate busting up good conversations. It's one of the hardest parts about my job. But sometimes duty calls. And beginning on time at Baylor in Washington is, well, it's not quite a duty, but it is something that we like to have happen. Philip, I love that you just said you're, that sort of evening. Good evening. There's lots of seats down here in the front row. I think we're also pulling in a few more seats. If you have taken a seat, and we can do this old school style, move to the center if there are open seats so that people can get in easily. That would be wonderful. Welcome. It's wonderful to have you out tonight. My name is Matthew Anderson. I'm an assistant director for Baylor in Washington. And it's wonderful to see so many people come out on an evening like this. The weather is just fantastic. I live in Waco, Texas, and the weather is also wonderful there right now, but I was especially pleased to not have to put on a winter coat here in DC. Baylor in Washington is a program. We are the official outpost of Baylor University here in Washington, D.C., and we host events like this on the regular, as my students sometimes say, or on the reg, they actually say. Regular events like this where we are interested in thinking about faith, the world around us, how the two intersect, and doing so in ways that are specifically tied to the Christian faith and everything that entails. So we're delighted to host tonight's conversation with Dr. Philip Jenkins. It is a custom for us here at Baylor in Washington to not read biographies for our speakers, in part because doing so is the least interesting part of every evening. We have a special reason tonight, though, to not read a biography. We'd be here for hours reading all of Dr. Jenkins' accomplishments and books and so on and so forth. He's a very esteemed author that I'm sure is known to all of you. If you are unfamiliar with who he is, there is a card that is on your seat that has tonight's program and a biography on the back to which I would refer you to. We are also delighted to have a co-sponsor this evening, the Church of the Advent, which is an Anglican community here in Washington, D.C. We are especially grateful to them for supplying tonight's alcohol. So, if you have enjoyed your wine, yes, you have them to thank for it, and we're very grateful to them. It's wonderful to have partners, and we're excited especially to partner with the local church, which is something that we would love to do more often. So if you are a member of a church and are interested in coming alongside us for an event like this, do find me afterwards. I'd like to invite Reverend Thomas Hinson up from Church of the Advent. Now, this is the first time that this has ever happened at Baylor in Washington, and so I feel a need to issue a kind of caveat. I'm only an assistant director, and our director, Dr. David Corey, could not be here this evening and sends his regards, and so I'm going rogue, shall we say. As we're sponsored by a church, and as it is the custom at Baylor University to begin every sporting contest with a prayer, I have asked Reverend Hinson to do the same here at Baylor in Washington, which we have never done, but seemed appropriate to me. So, Tommy, would you come up and welcome us, and then we'll begin.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for coming. And I'm delighted to be here. We at Church of the Advent, one of the verses that we refer back to again and again is that verse from 1 Chronicles 12, which refers to the men of Issachar. And it describes them in this really interesting way. It says, the men of Issachar and their families were people who understood the times and knew what Israel ought to do. And so we come back to that again and again as we think about the church and this particular cultural moment. We talk about the necessity for people who desire to live faithfully, to have a faithful presence in places like Washington, D.C., that it needs to be among our highest priorities to do the hard work of trying to understand the times, trying to understand this particular cultural moment, and then to understand the broader historical context in which we find ourselves. And so we need to see that as a priority in the church if we desire to live faithfully. And we need people like Dr. Philip Jenkins, a man of Issachar, so to speak. If you look at his the books that he's written, something like 30 books covering all manner of topics, you see that he's I think, a very well-equipped guide to help us think deeply about where we are, our society, our culture, and then we as the church can take conversations like this and then do the hard work of figuring out what does faithfulness look like here and now. And so I'm excited tonight for that reason in general. I'm also excited because this particular topic, believe it or not, has come up for me in my pastoral work. I have had people with whom I've been meeting for premarital counseling ask me, is it right for Christian couples to consider procreating and having children as a part of their marriage with all of the issues that we're facing regarding climate change? Is there a moral, ethical responsibility not to have children? And so this has come up, and so it's a live conversation, believe it or not, for us, and so I'm excited to hear what transpires tonight. So very excited to get into that. And yes, I would be delighted to pray. I would be delighted to do that. So please join me in prayer. Lord, we thank you for this night. And even though we're not in a church building, we pray that this, for those of us who are a part of your church, Lord, we pray that this would be an extension of the worshiping life of our various communities, that this would be your children coming together and seeking your wisdom, seeking understanding for the times in which we live, and seeking your guidance for what faithfulness looks like, Lord. We pray that you would bless and set apart this time. I pray that as we gather around this topic and as we open our minds to what is going to be discussed, I pray that our hearts would also be open to your presence, for we know that you are present with us now. And we pray that you would bless us, Lord, and we pray that you would bless us in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Please welcome Dr. Philip Jenkins.
Thank you very much. Welcome to tonight's ambush. The reason I say that is I agreed to talk about my book, Fertility and Faith, when Matt Anderson decided to stab me in the back by asking if I would talk about that and another recent book I wrote about climate, which I will do my best to do, but bear with me if it doesn't get equal coverage. Long story short, I want to talk about two different ways of looking at religion, which are maybe different or counterintuitive. And let me start by talking about the fertility one. I would argue that changes in fertility around the world over the last 40 or 50 years are among the most important and most central of any of the very major changes that have occurred. A little bit of vocabulary first. We measure a society's fertility by the number of children an average woman will have during the course of her reproductive life. If that number is around 2.1, then society will jog along pretty much as is. If it is much below 2.1, you get a significantly older society with far fewer children. And if it is way above 2.1, then you get a society with many, many young people, often a more turbulent, more dynamic society. I think that's going to be almost the only statistic I'm going to give you, so do not be disheartened. Here's the point. Over the last 50 years, for really the first time in human history, many societies around the world started recording very steep drops in fertility to way, way below what's called replacement rate, which is that 2.1 figure. That change originally happened in the 1960s in countries like the Scandinavian countries, Netherlands, and so on. So everyone said, well, this is very straightforward. It's to do with Protestantism and the European tradition and Lutheranism. And then in the 1970s, it started hitting all the Catholic countries. And the rate at which fertility was falling started becoming astonishing. Societies weren't producing fertility rates of 2.1, they were getting to 1.0, 0.8. And people were making comments about, are they trying to wipe themselves out? And it's an interesting question. But here's the interesting point. there's a very, very close correlation between that drop in fertility and the dramatic decline in faith and religiosity in those countries at the same time. Now, let me just emphasize, what I'm talking about here is particularly institutional religion. So people might still be having like a deep spirituality, whatever, but in terms of institutional religion, societies that have very steep drops in fertility are also likely to become much more secular. And you can measure this in Europe by a series of changes, for example, that occurred in countries like Spain and Italy, where you had referenda over moral issues that the churches, and particularly the Roman Catholic Church, bitterly opposed. And it began with allowing contraception, allowing divorce, and then it allowed abortion, and then you got to assisted suicide, and a whole series of more secular decisions like that. And that was the situation in the 70s and 80s, very sharply dropping fertility, sharply dropping levels of faith. In fact, if you look at Catholic Europe, I sometimes use what I call the criterion of 10. And what I mean by that is if you look at one of the measures of Catholic faith and activism around about 1960 and you compare it to today, divide by 10, and you've got a pretty fair guide. Number of vocations, population of monastic houses, whatever. Okay. And people looked at Europe and said, well, that's European. And we don't exactly know what's happening, but fortunately, it's going to be very different in the rest of the world where we have this great population explosion. If you're old enough to remember the population explosion, raise your hands now because it hasn't been around for a good long time. What happened was that what we call European rates of fertility started hitting East Asia, South Asia, and Latin America, which became even scarcer in children than Europe, and at the same time became much more secular. So right away, that suggests that you're looking at something that isn't connected with Catholicism or Lutheranism or Christianity. It appears to be connected with any society that has institutional religion. You know, there's one country I always like to cite here, which is a country that back in the 1980s had one of the most spectacular fertility rates of any country, which was a typical woman was expected to produce about 7 children in her lifetime. By about 2010, that was below a replacement and is presently at about Danish rates. What country am I talking about? Obviously, Iran. And some of the countries that have been hardest hit by the drop in fertility, and can I say here, and the drop in religious practice have been in the Middle East and in the Islamic world. You know, there was a great moment at a demographic conference back about 2008 or so, where a scholar was talking about these fertility drops, and he said, you know, what this means is there's one country, and if you look at what's happening to fertility, in a couple of years, it's going to be a way more secular country that cares a lot about rights. And that country is Tunisia. And literally, which does not happen at academic audiences, people laughed at him. Where did the Arab Spring begin? It began in Tunisia. Let me oversimplify this. If I take a country, and if I look at its fertility rate, I'm not claiming this as infallible, but I can make you a pretty good guess about what's happening to organized religion in that country, religious institutions, and particularly attitudes to key moral decisions, such as, and one criterion I use a lot in the Christian world, same-sex marriage. Some of the countries with the sharpest falling fertility rates and the sharpest rises in secularism are in Latin America. You know, you remember way back when people used to talk about the population bomb and the population explosion and so on, people used to look at countries like Brazil. Brazil has now settled on basically Danish rates of fertility. and is rapidly becoming a much more secular country. By far, the fastest growing segment of the population in religion is nuns. I don't mean N-U-N, I mean N-O-N-E. It's an easy mistake. People who say, when asked, what is your religious affiliation, they say none. I just don't have any. The faster the fertility rate falls, the more nuns there are. For many years, boy, I can take this in many different directions, trust me, but for many years, people used to say, well, there's Europe, which is low fertility, low faith. There's Africa, which is very high fertility, high faith. And then there's kind of the United States, which floats somewhere in between. That was probably true around about 2000, 2005, isn't anymore. In the 20-teens, and particularly after the great economic crash of 2008, the US started looking very, no offense, Danish. It started having fertility rates that were declining to Scandinavian levels, and you had a phenomenal increase in the number of nuns who, at the moment, there are three big religious groups in the US presently. There's Catholics, there's evangelicals, and there's nuns. The nuns at present are just about ahead. If you come back at the end of the decade, the nuns are going to be way ahead. I would argue, and we can talk about this, that during the 2020s, the United States is going to become, he said looking carefully, is going to become a much more European country in terms of its religiosity, in terms of its role for religion in public life. And if you think, am I over extrapolating from fertility rates? I'd say, fine, it's absolutely legitimate criticism, but things are working together. And I would defend that. There are a lot of these kind of surprises around the world. And I invite you to think of countries that you think of as being population bomb, population explosion. India used to be the great example of a country with an out-of-control population. At presently, half the states of India are well below replacement rate. Even the ones that are very high fertility are around 3.3, whereas they used to be about 7.3. And the world is moving very rapidly towards far lower fertility rates. And if what seems to be true across the world is correct, lower levels of religiosity, organized religiosity, different kinds of spirituality, yes. Organized religiosity is having a great many problems. Two comments about this. First of all, why is this happening? Let me just stress, it's easy to confuse causation and correlation. All I'm saying is, here's fertility, here's faith. They correlate very closely. I am not saying a change in one causes a change in the other necessarily. It might be that they both reflect some other change that is going on in society. I'm noting a correlation. I can suggest many factors that might be at work, but one of the key ones is, imagine if you have a traditional kind of society with lots and lots of children. Think of an Italian village back in the 1950s where you can't throw a stone without hitting a child. And then move forward to today when there are so few children and so few people over 75 that the village is basically close to defunct. Take children out of the equation of any religious institution, and what happens to people's ties to the religious institution? They no longer have the same necessity for being involved in that institution. And when you separate sex from reproduction, it becomes much easier for people to attack the religious institutions on an individualistic basis for restraints on contraception, abortion, homosexuality, whatever. We can talk about this. The causation is complex. One of the large things that happens is when women become educated, when more and more women have profitable employment as they do in with the spread of service industries, they can't afford to have 5 and 6 and 7 children. Normally, some can. They cannot afford the time. You see an excellent policy here by the Taliban, who have decided to eliminate girls' education as a way of promoting religiosity. It is a policy from the pit of hell, but in terms of linking women's role with religion, you know, they are seeing something. Is it the worst thing in the world? Yes, but they are drawing that link. I would also point out one thing, which is this change, low fertility, low faith, does not happen overnight. If you look at a particular country, often it affects different areas separately. So in that one country, you have an area that is very, what shall I say, European, low fertility, low faith. Women are all out at work. It's a much more secular society. And here you have a much more religious, traditional community. If you're a politician, which side are you going to align to? Where are the votes? And the votes are the teeming religious masses. And if you look at some of the situations around the world right now where you have very authoritarian regimes, like in Turkey or like in India, you find exactly that demographic divide that I'm talking about. In Turkey, if you show me an area, a province, and tell me what its fertility rate is, and I will tell you immediately whether they're going to vote for or against Mr. Erdogan. In India, ditto. Show me the fertility rate. I know whether they're for the BJP or not. You know, there are other countries. I have a good Israeli friend who writes a great deal about the Haredim, the ultra-Orthodox, who are very, very religiously active and very high fertility. And by most estimates, by 2050, they will constitute an absolute majority in the country. And I asked my friend, was this something that worried him? And he said, not in the slightest. I'll be dead. But there are certainly a number of countries like that. There are so many topics kind of growing out of this. I'm trying not to take too much of my time here. One book I'd like to write down the road is about low fertility warfare in a low fertility world, because it's totally different from what it's ever been in human history. And what we're seeing right now in Ukraine is a war between, a special military operation, not a war, between two of the lowest fertility countries on the planet. And if you want to see why the Russian army is suffering losses at a rate that has not been matched since the Battle of the Somme in 1916, look at what they're trying to do without having those teeming masses of 20 and 21-year-olds escorting the tanks. Look at how the Ukrainians are organizing. It is a demographic war. By the way, the other two countries in the world with the lowest fertility rates, well, let me see, there's North and South Korea, and there's China and Taiwan. So this could be quite a timely book generally. Haven't written it yet. But oh brother, I'm getting some material. By the way, this change around the world, whatever your area of interest, I'm talking about religion, if you're interested in commerce, if you're interested in politics, you know, what's the first question you ask? What's the demographics of the country? What is the market in the country? The demographics, the fertility rates just tell you so much. I get into a lot of other topics. In the book, I talk about the decline of death as a factor driving secularization. I don't mean we're not dying, but the nature of our deaths is changing dramatically in a way that causes great shifts in the role of clergy. And I also talk at length in my book about high fertility and high faith societies, which will continue to be such for decades to come, and above all, I mean virtually all of Africa, and large sections of South Asia and the Middle East. Very good news for Christians, very good news for Muslims. If you want to see the most populous Christian countries in the world in 2050, they tend to be very heavily African and equatorial based. I am just going to allude briefly to the other book. I read a book called Climate Catastrophe and Faith. Let me just explain that very briefly. What I argue in that is through human history, there have been a great many climate disasters for various reasons. They might be caused, for instance, by great volcanoes or shifts in solar energy. And there are some years, some decades that are absolutely catastrophic. The skies darken, people starve, there are plagues, there are droughts. Through most of human history, people respond to this religiously. Has anyone ever heard of a sermon called Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God by Jonathan Edwards? Largely, people have heard of it. Happened in July 1741. It's been studied in every possible way you care to note. Rhetoric, religion, theology. Does it help to know that the previous 2 years before he wrote were the worst weather in the previous half millennium? The people were getting used to the concept of 20-foot snow drifts. And people generally thought, the world is about to end very shortly. Let's see what the Reverend Edwards has to say about it. And what I try to do in this book is I try to take a number of these episodes and look at the religious consequences. The reason that bears on what I'm doing at the moment is the areas in the world with the highest demographic growth and the highest faith commitments are also the ones that are going to be hardest hit by climate change in areas like the Great Lakes of Africa and the Western Sahel. And if history is any guide whatever, a lot of those problems and grievances are going to take religious forms through what? Witchcraft persecutions. Don't forget, we live in the golden age of witchcraft presently, and it'll get worse. Messianic movements, new religious movements. And if this was going to happen just in those particular areas, that would be one thing. But we're looking for the great sources of migration to Europe in coming years. And if you have any interest in the fate of Europe, paying attention to those climatic changes is significant. And I think I'm about out of time, and I shall just hand over to the learned Professor Anderson. Thank you very much. Thank you so much.
So it's my pleasure to tease out a few things that you said, and then we'll open it up to you all for questions as well. So this is just a couple of questions for you. When it comes to these correlations, you said very explicitly you're only drawing a correlation, you're not drawing causation. I think, what do you think hangs on those correlations for religious people? What's the value of seeing naturalistic correlations for religious phenomena? Right, so if there's a growth of a certain type of religion, religious people are going to look for religious explanations for that. The growth of Christianity in Africa is clearly a work of the Holy Spirit that has, and raised up all these people. And that's one sort of explanation that can be given. Another sort of explanation that could be given is a sort of fertility rate explanation, right? Actually, it's not conversions by virtue of the Holy Spirit. It's this sort of thing that's causing it. What's the value of thinking in that sort of way for religious believers?
Yeah, very good question. The one does not prevent the other. Basically, so when I talk about Africa, for instance, during the 20th century, it was the scene of one of the greatest numerical changes of religion that has ever occurred everywhere, anywhere. The continent was basically 10% Christian at the start of the century, and almost 50% at the end of the century. But there were so many more people that the number of those Christians grew in the 20th century from 10 million to 360 million. Now, a couple of things are happening. One is, yes, sure, there are lots of conversions from 10% to 50%, but 50% of a vastly, vastly bigger number. So the one does not separate the other. And, it's inconceivable for me that if you have somebody, for instance, who's interested in missions, that they would not pay attention to the context, if you like, the market that they're trying to serve, and also as a practical tool, because the demographic structure of a society decides how you can speak to that society. If, for example, you're dealing with lots of nuclear families, people who work in kind of very stable economic settings, then you know how to speak to them. You can speak to them through family settings, through schools. Suppose you have a totally atomized society where people are mainly single. They're in jobs that last for, 6 months maybe. How do you deal with an atomized society like that? That's a key kind of missional question. And you get a solution like the British device of the Alpha Course, which is geared for that kind of atomized society, which is based on networking. It doesn't assume everyone's got kids. They don't go to the same school. They're not at the same workplace. I talk to you. You talk to her. She talks to him. We get together and set up those new kind of communities. Also, if you don't have traditional community, it is a phenomenal advantage for churches or religious groups to offer a kind of community. So I would argue that the demographics are essential to determining the message, which messages will work and which will not.
Good, that's helpful. Can I pick up a thread that you reached at the very end of your talk, which is about migration in relationship to climate change? So one of the stories that I think you tell in the Fertility book is about the correlation between a certain type of liberalism and declining fertility. As you say, women go into the workforce, individual rights become more prominent. That's correlated with declines in fertility. As those declines in fertility happens, Derek Thompson describes the doom loop of liberalism. As declines in fertility occur, those societies rely more on immigrants to sustain their workforce and the like. Many of those immigrants come from highly religious countries, and that creates a sort of authoritarian backlash against the liberal society, or a populist backlash against society. Here's what I want to know. If that's the case, and if what we have underneath conditions of climate change is the growth of highly authoritarian, more radicalized religions that are migrating into liberal societies, what sort of effects does that have on places like America and Europe?
Okay. Yeah. Let me just clarify one thing. I don't want to be misunderstood about this. When I talk about women going to the workforce, women get educated, wonderful. If I was to say anything else, my daughters would strangle me. And so much of what I'm describing here is often associated with an improvement of concepts of rights and well-being, and so much that is entirely good. So much of that think about it. If you have a society where the median age is in the mid-40s, which is what you're getting in a number of European countries right now, then you need a lot of immigrants in those countries to do the jobs, pay the taxes. Great majority of those migrants are not only phenomenally useful, and valuable to the countries, they also are bringing back religious values that often have been lost in those countries. We're in Washington, D.C. right now. One of the great pleasures I always have around here is meeting all the people who are Ethiopian and Eritrean and were Christian for a generation or two before the Roman Empire even thought of it. So, this is not just a deep Christianity, it's a truly ancient Christianity. So, yes, indeed, you can get some groups that do, challenge the liberal order, but I just want to put them in perspective. So I'm kind of endlessly fascinated by immigrant Christianity in Europe and America. The other thing I find very interesting is, Baylor University is in Texas. Houston in Texas is the Nigerian capital of the United States. It has, 120,000 Nigerians who are phenomenally and passionately active in their churches, and that's the base for expansion throughout the United States, which, from my prejudiced point of view, is an unalloyed good. So, it's not a doom loop. It's come on board. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good answer. I mean, one thing that happened a few years back is you had the leaders of 3 prominent European countries who were all childless. Macron, Theresa May, and Merkel of France, Germany, and the UK, all probably for the first time since those countries existed, all 3. And I'm curious, you mentioned how that detaches people's affiliation with organized religion. And I wonder what sort of effects that has on people's attachment to political orders. Is there a similar detachment to, and is part of the alienation that people feel from their governments aligned with this?
Oh boy. Yeah, it's a complicated set of things that are happening, but you do see it a little bit in the United States, where you have politicians presenting, if you like, concepts of family and a vocabulary of family, which is speaking to an ever declining share of the population. And it becomes stranger and more distant. So, in terms of what you can assume about family, it's very different. I think a lot of us are still stuck in the idea from the 60s and 70s, where you have Scandinavia, and we think of it in terms of very low fertility and very, very secular, and shades of Ingmar Bergman rise up occasionally. Can I suggest that's a very typical model of the rest of the world these days, including much of Asia and Latin America, and increasingly the United States. And I don't think a lot of us have really come to terms about that. Just one measure that I use, I talk about the revolution in death. There's one fascinating thing, there's one correlation around the world, which very few people ever pick up. I've talked about fertility. It's cremation. Up until the 1880s, if you tried to cremate a body in Great Britain, you were regarded as equivalent to a serial killer, and you went to prison. And there's an inverse correlation between the rise of cremation and the decline of religion, and you can map it around the world, and the point at which cremation becomes the normal kind of disposal, contrary to what most of the churches were saying right up until a very late point. In the 1930s, C.S. Lewis wrote at huge length against the evils of cremation. And that's another of my, my measures. So many things which 50 or 60 years ago would have been regarded as outside the pale of religion have become absolutely accepted. And I'm not saying they're necessarily bad. In the words of Seinfeld, not that there's anything wrong about that. But I'm saying that maybe we don't pay so much attention to these things because we take them for granted.
I'm just going to say, if you had on your bingo card him delivering the Seinfeld reference and not me, you win tonight's prize. I certainly didn't anticipate that. That's great. So one of the things you say in your climate change book, which is a wonderful read, and in certain ways extremely distressing, is you've succeeded in inducing some anxiety in me about the future. One of the things that you say there is that extreme times bring extreme religion. And you project the rise of a non-modern, non-progressive religion around parts of the globe. As climate change goes up and as people respond to it in apocalyptic terms and sort of intensify their religious commitments in light of these sorts of climate disasters. At least that's how I understood you. Sure. I'm curious, what sort of effects do you think that will have on U.S. politics or U.S. society?
Well, the first useful one would be when whenever the State Department is discussing a problem in a particular country, the first question they need to ask is, what is its latitude? Because that affects how directly it is hit by climate change. By the way, just to give you a concrete example of that historically, one of the worst volcanic catastrophes that ever befell the Earth that shows up in ice records and plant records around the world happened in 626 AD. And you think, 626 AD, what happened then? And then you realize that would have sent great black evil clouds around the world. It would have caused famine, it would have caused plague, it would have caused drought. We happen to know that the Byzantine and the Persian empires were fighting each other at that point, but they both basically collapsed because of these things. And the only force in the world that was really doing very well out of this was a new army that had arisen in Arabia serving a prophet called Muhammad, who up until 626 was getting nowhere, and in 627, 28, and 29 went on to basically win and ultimately conquer the whole Arabian Peninsula. So 626 was wonderful if you were a doomsday prophet, because you could just say, don't believe me, look. What is this? How does this affect the United States? Once again, the, quote, economically advanced countries can afford to ride out a lot of these changes, at least in the middle term. Those countries that are, you know it, Western educated, industrial, rich and democratic, W-E-I-R-D, weird. The weird countries can ride out a lot of these changes. You know, you look at the Netherlands, for example. The Netherlands is a country that is entirely built on surviving and withstanding the climate. The poorer countries, the countries that by definition have done nothing to bring on these disasters, do not have such advantages. And those are the ones where you really do face extremely serious, extreme rising populations, countries that over a period of 100 years are going from 3 and 4 million to 70 and 80 million. And where the temptations of extreme religion are very marked indeed. I mean, I focus a lot on the Western Sahel. If you ever look at the Western Sahel, if you think, I want to look this up on a map, the first maps you'll see are all in terms of migration routes of from Africa to Southern Europe. What are people picking up as they go on these routes? They're picking up some very interesting ideas, which presently are at the extreme of Islamist thought. I wonder how long it'll be before there is a new religion in response to this. And I don't know. I am, as they say, a professor, not a prophet.
Well, I hear it's a very good time to get into the prophet business, and they sell a lot of books. So if you
benefits are excellent.
You've read the Times well. So last question. So we'll take your questions after this. So do be thinking about them. My colleague Nate will be coming around with a microphone, and I'll moderate the queue for you. But tying these two themes together, Tommy mentioned this at the beginning, which I appreciated. Climate anxiety seems like a real thing, and it's certainly been in the headlines a lot. You have Harry and Meghan, perhaps most prominently, announcing that they would only have at most 2 children because of climate concerns. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez here in the United States created something of a social media or pundit kerfuffle when she said that perhaps people should consider not having children for the sake of climate concerns. Are these sorts of anxieties, is this sort of pressure to not have children, does it have historical precedent? And what should we make?
You know, I'm interested in one correlation there. One fact that we know, everyone knows about demographics, is the baby boom, right? The baby boom lasted from 1945 to 1962. If you want to think of the mid-year of that, you would think of about 1954, right? Think what's happening in the world at that point. Think of the nuclear fears, the hydrogen bomb, we are all going to die within a year, and the fact that that has absolutely no impact on people having children. Which does lead me to believe that whatever somebody may think about what should be done, it is unlikely to have a major impact on people's behavior beyond a few very, very high-profile folks like Harry and Meghan, and I'm being very well behaved. I'm saying nothing about them at all right now. They never invited me to their wedding. What can I say? So I'm not sure how much that would have, how far that would have an impact. But you know, it's very interesting what does have an impact. Certainly, what governments can do to make families have more or less children, more or fewer children. Certainly when governments pour resources into saying, we want much, much larger families, they pour huge amounts in and they get very, very little back. So in some ways it's a very optimistic thing, which is people tend to live their own lives and ignore governments. So are people likely to have small families on those grounds? I sort of doubt it. How that will actually affect things, I don't know, but I suspect no, any more than the many, many people in the 1950s who said, I'm not having children because of nuclear war, or in the 1960s said, I'm not having children because of the population bomb.
Yeah, that's good. That's helpful. We'll go ahead and take your questions now. So feel free to jump in the queue. I'll go start here, and I've got a mental cue, but remind me. So here on the edge, Nate. And if I cut you off in case you go on too long, just forgive me.
Forgive you in advance here. Dr. Jenkins, you mentioned these policy incentives and financial incentives that countries from Hungary all the way to Singapore have deployed to very little effect.
Yep.
Lyman Stone has pointed out, I think, that there's in the case of the Republic of Georgia, there's this instance where there's this concerted religious-led campaign to boost fertility that seems to have worked, including a promise by the patriarch of the Georgian Orthodox Church to baptize third children personally. What does your research show about the opportunities that churches and religious movements have to restore higher levels of fertility in countries where they have fallen?
See, one of the problems there, I have enormous respect for Lyman Stone's superb work on this topic. Even in Georgia, I tend to see that as ultimately a limited effect. One of the problems is that by the time churches start getting active in restoring fertility rates, they have already suffered so much by way of secularization and the decline of the respect that they previously had, that their views carry far less weight. You know, one argument I have made, for example, is there's a very interesting correlation around the world between these moments where you get the drops in fertility rate and the outbreak of scandals about organized religion, whether they're sexual or financial or whatever. And I don't think what's happening is you get a sex scandal or a financial scandal, and therefore people stop being religious. They become less religious, therefore they're more willing to believe stories that have been around before. And so it's the secularization that produces the scandals. And once you have a church that is associated with so many stories of abuse, financial malpractice, whatever, and they say, we want to effect a change in social policy, it seems to be not so convincing. And incidentally, exactly what I'm saying works in Asian and Buddhist countries also. You get the decline in fertility, you get the decline in religious practice, and that's the point at which you start getting the finance scandals and the sex scandals. So, which comes first? It might be that Georgia is, a very exceptional circumstance in that way. I don't know enough about it in detail, but generally speaking, I think it would be very, very difficult to sustain that in any way.
That's helpful.
It's a real quick
Question back there.
Hi. As someone who lives in a densely populated city, it may be difficult to appreciate the declining fertility rate. And even though I think DC, the population might have actually decreased during COVID, but I mean, there are so many cities in the US that are booming, like someone who lives in Nashville or Austin or even Bozeman, Montana might just feel like there are too many people living there, so we don't need more people.
Right.
And, I've also heard that there's just statistically population trends are going more to coastal areas. So I'm wondering if this is an area you've looked at, if there is any correlation with declining fertility rates, yet these areas that are, really growing and, and people in these cities might be maybe they're more concerned with the climate because they're like, well, we have too many people here and pollution and all that.
The larger Waco gets, the more concerned with the climate I become.
This is true. Yeah. One of the interesting things there is about the nature of the change and whether it is natural growth and having children or whether it's migration, because that affects the age profile of the community. Some of the correlations you get there are really interesting. There was one that was this is from 2004. This is way back. In the 2004 election in the U.S., there was a near perfect correlation between the fertility rate of U.S. states and their vote, Republican or Democratic. High fertility all went red, low fertility all went blue. The only exception was Michigan, which was a relatively high fertility state that went blue, but it had unions. Make of it what you will. You can do something like that in some later elections, and it's quite predictive. But it is quite interesting that those fertility rates are so useful. A lot of what you're talking about, if I'm hearing you correctly, is about a growing population, but very much in terms of migration, as opposed to very very large numbers of children. And once again, we get back to our immigrant thing. By definition, because immigrants tend to be young and the appropriate age, they often tend to have reasonably large families, large numbers of children. And people say, "Oh my Lord, they're going to be taking over the country," which they do for about 2 generations, and then they join the established norm of the host population. Which is why France will never be Muslim, whatever. Yeah. So I don't know if I'm getting to your point there. Yeah.
I mean, maybe another way to ask the question would be: are climate concerns, have you
Yeah.
seen climate concerns be differentiated according to urban versus rural? So would
Yeah,
climate
it's very
concerns
good.
be more prevalent in densely populated urban contexts because there are just lots of human beings around versus rural areas, less urban areas where, you know, there's more space to grow a family.
Right.
And, you know, you do have, it's a real thing in DC and in other cities where I just talked with a friend who are about to have their fourth child, and you'd better believe they moved from the Hill to Alexandria because 4 children on the Hill is intolerable, and you have to move somewhere out. So, you know, invert the question and ask, you know, climate concerns, urban versus rural.
Yeah. Yeah, as I said, so much of the problem with debating climate in the US is that for most people, climate is something that happens elsewhere in the world. You know, we tend not to see direct consequences because this is such an advanced country technologically. Historically, you have to imagine a society where people spend maybe 80% of their income on food, and where when the price of food goes up because of bad harvest or something, they really notice. You know, 1991, for example, you had the Great Pinatubo volcano in the Philippines. This was one of the biggest volcanoes for centuries. Did anyone actually register it in the US? Did we have famine? Did we have rioting in the streets? No. If you're a surfer, maybe it posed a couple of bad problems in California, but otherwise, no. And that's the change. In other parts of the world, something like Pinatubo had a huge impact. So as yet, most Americans are still very insulated from climate change. And you know, you can say, okay, forest fires in California. Yeah, absolutely. But as yet, it's not the sort of perceived existential threat that it is in many parts of the world. And that's a key difference. It's very hard to get people marching in the streets on something that's theoretical.
Good, that's helpful. So we'll go here on the end.
So in your book, In the Next Christendom,
Yeah.
you talk about Christianity moving toward Africa.
Yeah.
And yet Africa is going to double in population in the next 30 to 40 years.
Yep.
So are we looking at an unmitigated disaster there?
Boy. A couple of things are happening in Africa. Just in terms of religion, boy. Back in 1900, there were 10 million Christians in Africa. That number reached about 500 million by 2015. It'll probably hit 1 billion or so by the 2040s. So we're talking about phenomenal increases. That'll be the first time in history that any continent will have 1 billion Christians. That'll be about, a third of the world population. But that doesn't count African exiles elsewhere in the world, like Houston, Texas, or Europe. Is it necessarily a disaster? Think of Africa in 2050. Africa, by the way, right now, is going through the largest urbanization in human history. A lot of places that most of us have never heard of, like Bamako, are going to be phenomenally large cities of 15, 20, 25 million people. The question then is, can society cope with those numbers? And what has been happening is that the people who've done the most to supply people's needs have been religious organizations. They've been churches, or they've been Muslim organizations, which are the ones that provide the welfare, education, health. Because the states have been so weak, they've often been failed states. Are we talking unmitigated disaster? I would say no. We're talking about a very difficult situation, which if the weird nations of the United States and North America and Europe have any sense, they will try and assist as best they can there, if only for the purely selfish reason that they do not want very, very large numbers of migrants in their own territories. But it's a dangerous situation in some ways, but it's also a very intriguing situation. You know, you're dealing with very new kind of social forms, cultural forms, religious forms. It's a very interesting thing to observe, but it's dangerous. You know, I look at a city like Nairobi, which in the 1950s had maybe 250,000 people. Now it's up to, I don't know, what is it now? 15 million, 18 million. That'll double by 2050. Would you like anyone who wishes to be the mayor of Nairobi? Raise your hands right now. How do you do it? People are very, very good at coping with situations, but it's going to require a great deal of effort and a great deal of work. I remember once presenting this to an African audience, and the response from a Christian leader was, "You put a great burden on us Africans." And I apologized, but it's going to be a phenomenal charge and task for those religious organizations especially. They will have to take the lead.
That's helpful. So go here on the end.
First, thank you for the engaging lecture and discussion. So you made, I think, almost an offhanded comment, but I'm really curious about where you said that we presently live in the golden age of witchcraft.
Oh, yeah.
And I just thought I'd ask about that. Thank you.
Sure.
Good.
Okay.
Very good.
Was that the question, or was that the first part of the question?
That's the
whole
whole
question.
What on
All
earth
right.
were you talking about,
All
I
right.
think?
Okay, here we go. It was widely believed for many years that witchcraft was associated with, if you like, pardon the expression, primitive village communities. Once people moved into cities, once they realized that you hit that switch and the light went on, they learned about science and they no longer believed in witchcraft. And then you saw what was happening to witchcraft charges and trials and allegations in many African urban areas. You look at the number of new churches which begin as anti-witchcraft movements, and some of them stay at that level. You look at the main centers of witchcraft allegations in Africa, which are often associated with places like Soweto in South Africa. And in terms of raw numbers, we live in the golden age of witchcraft. Now, one thing that I found in my climate book is if you map peaks and valleys, if you like, in the discovery and investigation of witchcraft, there's a near perfect correlation with climate disasters. You find, you name something like the idea that witches are an alternative religion and they make a pact with the devil. 1320, one of the worst years for climate in European and world history. You look at the writing of the great anti-witchcraft manuals, you look at the great trials, correlation. In the United States, there isn't going to be anything like that. In a society where witchcraft is deeply, deeply part of the fabric, and I above all mean Africa, that there is a great deal of this in South Asia, Southeast Asia, Indonesia, then I think it is highly likely that environmental and climate threats will lead to an atmosphere of paranoia, suspicion, and who did this? Who caused this disease? Who caused my child to die? And we have a great intellectual structure for this in witchcraft. And oh, brother, there are so many individual entrepreneurs and profit makers who will come out and say, I can get rid of your witches. And if you ever want to see a great, great film on this, there's I'm going to get this wrong, is it Malawian? There's a terrific African film called I'm Not a Witch, which is a case study of a woman accused of witchcraft in a very contemporary world. Therefore, QED, we live in the golden age of witchcraft. Next.
That's a lot bleaker and darker than the answer that I was expecting, which is something like Wicca is big on Instagram, which is actually true. We've got a question in the very back. And then even farther back after that, Nate, we'll go there next. Okay.
Thank you, and sorry. So I wanted to pick up on two themes. One is just your experience and engagement with the global church, and secondly, what you mentioned tonight about your kind of hypothesis or your projection that a lot of the places where numerical growth will be the strongest and where Christianity will be the most deeply rooted are also those places most likely to be adversely impacted by climate change.
Yeah.
And that will drive significant migration. So what I'm wondering, to kind of cut to the chase, is speaking to those of us who consider ourselves Christians, what's our responsibility, in your viewpoint, to those who will be fleeing these impacts? And secondly, what do you think our posture should be as members of what you've called weird nations? Thanks.
Yeah. Well, several things. Let me just emphasize one thing. Where you're looking at Africa, for example, you're talking about Christians and Muslims. Very much so. What should Christians do? The first thing is already with like African Christian communities that are here right now, there is so much that can be learnt from them, that can be shared with them. They're a phenomenal resource that I think so many white American churches do not take enough advantage of in a good way. I think it was Andrew Walls, the great scholar of global Christianity, who said, look, if you want to see Christianity in the 2nd century, you have a choice. You can invent a time machine. You can buy an air ticket to Africa. And the air ticket's easier. Good news, you don't need it because they have come here. So if you are interested in the many forms of Christianity, and if you can look at some of these churches and not be impressed and overwhelmed, you have a heart of stone. My first response was to say something very, very conventional about, hospitality, fine, these strange people coming in. But then you realize, good Lord, you look at these churches and they are so, and these traditions, and they are so rich in what they bring. And may I just add, I think a lot of Westerners also tend to associate these like Muslim immigrants with these very dangerous Islamist movements which do exist. But so many of the ones coming from Africa, again, come from these very rich traditions of Islam that have been very neglected in recent years. So one posture, I would say, is gratitude. At what is arriving on your shores. In that way, there is so much that can be learnt. Now, the other thing is to get an understanding of the conditions that are driving this, and that gets to all sorts of political movement and support of technology. I am not one of those who believes that, for instance, cutting emissions alone will solve the problem. I think there are whole technologies of carbon capture and retention that are going to be much more significant along the way. But we have to look at it in terms of individuals, of people, of families, and of those large-scale policy issues.
Good. That's helpful. We've got time for just a couple more questions, so all the way back there.
Easy. And it's also over here.
Oh,
Yeah.
thank you, Professor Jenkins. We are big fans, and thank you for the talk tonight. I just had a question about one of your key points was that as the population decline, one of the correlation is that they become more secular.
Yeah.
I just wanted to know, is that the case for just the weird countries, or is it also for the case of all the other countries,
Yes.
such as like China?
Yeah.
Are we looking at like fastly declining in population in China? Are you also thinking that it will continue or become more and more secular if it can become more and more secular? Or is there even a chance that China can become a Christianized or some sort of a religious country?
Okay. Very good question. I would let me answer it a little bit broadly. The first one is, yes, this entirely works outside the West. And the example I would choose as a very interesting one is South Korea, which for many years has been cited as an example of, like a great near-Christian conversion, Christian Reformation, and so on. And then you talk to Korean church leaders, and what's their response? There aren't any young people. And Korea has, if it's not the lowest fertility rate in the world, it's like number 2. I mean, it's up there. If you look at the statistics on religions, they appear every 5 to 10 years in Korea. Buddhism is rapidly approaching obliteration. Christian numbers were surging in the 80s and 90s, flatlined, and have been going down dramatically. But if you're a Korean nun, the future is yours. And it's the nuns who are growing dramatically. China is such a problem. And I talk about this in the book. With most countries like Korea, these tendencies happen, if you like, spontaneously. Okay, they happen from grassroots. So much of what happened in China happened from above. The government said there will be a one-child policy. And it makes it very hard to correlate that. For a great many years, I think Westerners had very high hopes of Christianity growing rapidly in China. There are already a lot of Christians in China. My number would be 70 million or so, which is more than any European country. Whether that can continue, I do not know, but you're dealing with such a harsh and rigid government system, such a controlling government system, it is exceedingly difficult to know. One book I have a great regard for, Ian Johnson wrote a wonderful book called The Souls of China. And it's a survey of Christians and Taoists and so many other groups. And the problem with it is the book appeared in, I want to say, 2015 or 2016. And already this wonderful book is almost out of date, because the government has become so harsh and repressive towards religion ever since. So things happen so much. If I can betray the mood of the evening by being hopeful at the moment.
Well, please.
Yeah.
I was going to ask you at the end, but feel free.
If you look at the history of Christianity in China, I can summarize it for you very quickly. It's gone through 5 cycles. Which begins in the 6th century, and Christianity grows and surges and is about to take over the whole country, and then it is ruthlessly repressed, destroyed, and is never going to rise again until 200 years later. It grows and surges and is about to take over the whole country until it's ruthlessly destroyed, never to rise again. You get the idea. 5 stages. And we're now at the peak at stage 5. So it's quite likely that in our lifetimes we'll hear about the extinction of Christianity in China. But don't believe it. That's just in human time frames.
That's a great question.
God thinks in millennia. We had a question over there.
Yeah, thank you for your talk. And my question kind of piggybacks off of the previous one, which has to do with kind of how you understand secularization theory. It seems like you're making a correlation between secularization and kind of rising economic development. Sure. But I'm kind of wondering, I guess the short version of the question is, like, do you see any countervailing trends against that or against secularization? And this may not be the greatest example, but it came to mind talking about Ukraine earlier, at least in terms of its evangelical population. That has actually grown quite considerably over the last few decades, and maybe that's pulling from the Orthodox population, and it's still not very big in absolute terms, but it has grown, and that growth has correlated with Ukraine becoming a more open and economically developed country in the last few decades. So I'm just curious if you've seen any instances kind of cutting against what would seem to be that secularization trend in developed countries.
Yeah. Absolutely. Ukraine, by the way, is a country I've been writing about for many years for one reason. It has, I think I'm right in saying, the lowest fertility rate in Europe. When it became independent in '92, it had a population of 50 million. Just recently, it was 45 million before the war. And that's a real contraction. So there was a lot of fertility drop. The growth that you're talking about is very interesting. It was driven by immigration. And there's a great story there. Back in the 1980s, the Soviets, anyone remember the Soviets, decided to bring in talented third world people into the Soviet Union to make them good Marxist-Leninists, okay? They brought in one guy whose name was Sunday Adelaja, and he basically, when the Soviet Union collapsed, he remained there, and he set up what rapidly became the largest Christian congregation in Europe, with 50,000 members in the congregation. You may be wondering where you put 50,000 members in your congregation. I know the Church of the Advent is dealing with this as a problem right now. But the good news is, it's the former Soviet Union, and so there were all these great halls they'd built for like Communist Party congresses. And if ever you've wondered what the historical role of communism was, it was to build buildings large enough for African Pentecostal churches. So it was very much immigrant driven. But it was immigrant leaders. It was Nigerian leaders. And you go on their website, and trust me, this is all before the war, okay? And it's a Nigerian leader, small handful, and a vast number of regular people who are white, Ukrainian, Russian, Belarusian, who are reporting these amazing Pentecostal miracles of being raised from the dead, being cured of cancer, cured of AIDS. But it's an immigrant-driven, African-driven experience, okay? As in many parts of Europe, the largest megachurches are African. The 4 largest megachurches in Britain, yes, there are megachurches in Britain, are all African. The largest megachurches in France and Belgium are all what? Congolese, Madagascarian. So it's that immigrant role. You know the great counter example to my my case, my argument? Poland. Poland has, I think, the second or third lowest fertility rate in Europe, and still has incredibly high levels of church attendance, pilgrimage, vocations. How do I resolve this? My argument is there's a hangover of a couple of decades because of the very special relationship of Polish nationalism to religion focused on John Paul II. And I would say that right now you are starting to see the signs of secularization like you did in Western Europe. We can argue this. But a great counterexample is Poland. And I'm being honest.
Yeah.
Okay?
Good. We've got time for one more question, which is just here.
Thank you very much. Really appreciate the talk. I do kind of want to come back to the witchcraft thing a little bit. So thinking about the nuns, I'm not a scholar on this sort of thing, but I seem to gather that a lot of the nuns are really interested in things like witchcraft and astrology.
Yes.
There's the whole Tara Isabella Burton idea that their religiosity has just sort of changed into this sort of makeshift thing that takes these different forms. when I think about the environmental reaction, right, to pollution, climate change, things like that, there's talk of almost like a secular religion that is almost growing up around.
Secular apocalyptic.
Yeah, environmentalism. Do you think there might be a future when you talk about climate disasters associating with religious enthusiasm? Do you think there's a possibility for some kind of like secular religion, almost like being created or grown in the coming years?
He's got a plan to sell books, is really what he's at.
No. And I'm very glad you mentioned the Burton book. That's one I've written about. It's very interesting. And what is so important about it is she pays so much attention to the role of social media in a way that a lot of scholars of religion and new religions and cults don't. I think it's absolutely admirable stuff. Within the West, again, I don't think so. You have a lot of very kind of diffuse, what you might loosely call kind of new agey ideas, but I don't think you have the stimulus that is going to turn them into a really, major movement. And I made that argument, and then I get socked in the back of the head by something like QAnon, which seems to be, emerging as a semi-quasi sort of religion before our eyes. I have a great interest in QAnon in one way because I actually read the 1969 science fiction book where they got a lot of their ideas from, and I'm the only person who's ever pointed that out, and I want recognition for it. It's called Bug Jack Barron by Norman Spinrad. But I don't know. I think it's a very interesting question. Would that it were all Wicca. These are nice, harmless, friendly folk. But I want to make one interesting comment about that. For those of you who no longer have your subscription to Witches and Pagans magazine, in case it's dropped, Witches and Pagans magazine had a really interesting feature recently. Yes, there is such a thing. They send it in plain brown wrappers, whatever. It was a very interesting thing, and they were interviewing a bunch of senior witches and pagans in the US about what had happened in recent years and how they felt about the future. And what they all, to a man, woman, and elf, said was, "We don't have any young people." And I read this article, and I thought, who are they, Episcopalians? And every damn word they said could have come from a church mainliner. These young people, you can't get them along to the rituals. And no, I mean, I feel like giving them a hug. Anyway, that's an Episcopal lament.
That's hard to follow that. This has been a delightful conversation, and I'd like to take the opportunity to ask one final question, which has been supplied by my colleague Nate Mills, who is, of course, a good Canadian, and that is, we really want your true thoughts about Harry and Meghan. Would you just lay it out for us?
No.
That was kind of a joke.
Yeah.
I am interested.
Yeah, I'm very struck how much he looks like his father. Oops.
That was for you, Nate. So I don't want to ask you as though you are a member of the Witches and Pagans Society, but I am interested to know, in the near term, what do you anticipate? What changes do you anticipate in the near term in the United States around dialogues surrounding faith, fertility, and climate change? With the public discussions about this, what are we missing, and what should we pay special attention to as these debates increase over the next decade? Because I don't think they're going away. And so what are the sort of key things that you think we should attend to as we're dialoguing with friends, neighbors, and in our public square about these issues?
It comes back to the first question you asked, which is, if you talk about a materialist basis for religion, is that somehow a betrayal of, if you like, the spiritual core of religion, and no, absolutely not. If you are running or active in any church and you are interested in outreach, you have to know those material bases. And what I'm saying is that the demographics and the fertility and the family structures always have been and are way up top in understanding how people are going to receive messages. So it's a question of how you package things, how you take account of the audience you are speaking to. And I have spoken about demography very broadly. I think that's a very important one. That is, interesting thought in seminaries, for example. People learn about all sorts of things. I would suggest that this is a pretty important topic people need to know about. You're interested in evangelism. You're interested in missions. Wonderful. But what sort of community are you talking to? Should you be spending as much time as you are thinking of children and youth ministries, instead of preparing for a world where by far the fastest growing of the segment is the oldest old, people of 85 and up? So yeah, that's a real quick answer.
That's very helpful. This has been terrific. Would you join me in thanking Dr. Jenkins? And I definitely want to thank you all for your time and attention this evening, and of course, our thanks to our friends at the Church of the Advent as well for your support of tonight's conversation. We invite you to stick around. I just do want to flag one thing. There was a flyer for both a discount for the other book that came up this evening, and so do take advantage of that. It's really a terrific read. And there's also a flyer for a forthcoming seminar on political theology that Baylor in Washington is hosting. This is for early career professionals. We're eager to get the word out about it. It's terrific. We have a phenomenal lineup of speakers. It's in the late summer here in DC. It's application only, but if there are young professionals you know who are interested in thinking about political theology, we'd love it if you would help us spread the word about that to them here over the next month. So thank you so much. Please do feel free. There's still wine and drinks available. Feel free to grab one and stick around. We'd love to chat. Thank you.